When you Google the word Screwjob, the first thing that pops up is images related to that infamous WWE moment. And when you think of Screwjobs, the first thing that always comes to a wrestling fan's mind is the Montreal Screwjob, the infamous 1997 Survivor Series main event for the WWE Championship between Bret the Hitman Hart and Shawn Michaels, where Bret Hart, the Canadian hero, was screwed out of the championship legitimately by the promotion of WWE on his way out of the company, and the fans got screwed in the process. There's no denying that it is one of the most regrettable moments in wrestling history from every angle that it has been observed in retrospect. There are multiple documentaries and a whole lot of media going into it, so much so that anyone interviewing Bret Hart today basically has to work their way around the issue. Because of that, we're not going to go into the Montreal Screwjob that much. It is, for an unfortunate reality, the most well-known version of this practice. Instead, we're going to dive into the history of wrestling's most notorious screwjobs and the finishes with the psychology behind them. The unfortunate truth is that there are probably a lot more of them that we simply don't know about publicly. So don't get up in arms at us for not covering every single incident of backstabbery out there.
Stand back. There's a new wrestling quiz coming through. Check out BrainBuster, the daily quiz that tests your WWE knowledge with winning streaks, stats, and more. It's time to see if you're up for the challenge.
At the center of it all lies the historically carny nature of the professional wrestling industry itself. It's always existed and only worsened maybe throughout the time. Yeah, who is in on it and who is not in on it? A carny business meant that there were a lot of carny figures doing carny things. One of wrestling's original screwjobs came all the way back in the 1910s. Yes, we're going back that far. It revolved around two of wrestling's biggest superstars at the time, Frank Gotch and George Hackenschmidt. The series of matches they had were so old that the Titanic hadn't even set sail yet and wouldn't do so for another year. Heck, even World War I didn't happen until a few years later after their rematch. This was an era of big, tough, legitimate men, and the clash of titans ended up damaging the wrestling industry as a whole. Yes, there was real grappling, shooters shooting with each other, but even back then, the business held its big secrets very close to the chest. And one of them was the predetermined nature of the beautiful sport. In the first bout, Gotch used an underhanded tactic to end Hackenschmidt's undefeated record, but he proved to be Gotch's toughest opponent up until then. Naturally, a rematch 3 years later was always going to be a big money draw. It generated a record-breaking $87,000 gate, well over $2 million in today's money. There are a lot of contradictory stories about this incident, so we're going to condense it in the best way that we can. In the build-up and training for the bout, Gotch notoriously hired someone known as a hooker. No, not that type of hooker, but the hooker wasn't for him. No, let me explain. Gotch reportedly hired someone to train with Hackenschmidt, and it's time to tell you what these two kinds of hookers actually did. This is getting confusing, that word bothers me. They were submission specialists with the notorious reputation for breaking a bone or two if needed. This hooker, hired by Gotch, supposedly went a little too hard on Hackenschmidt, leaving him with a busted knee. There was a lot of money on the line. Even though Hackenschmidt wanted to pull out of the fight, the promoters convinced him to stay in the mix. Gotch, being the humble man that he was, even told Hackenschmidt that he would make him look good and let him save at least one fall in their 2 out of 3 falls match. That's unfortunately not what happened. When the bell rang, the World Heavyweight Champion Frank Gotch went right after that injured knee of Hackenschmidt and made the bout go less than 20 minutes, picking up 2 straight falls and going back on his word. Presumably heartbroken after knowing he was betrayed, George Hackenschmidt would exit the arena. The incident banged up his knee really badly. Remember that it was 1911. The medical advancements we've seen since then were not there for a knee like his. This would be Hackenschmidt's last dance in the ring. It damaged the reputation of professional wrestling, which went on a decades-long battle of trying to protect the business and not give away those predetermined nature of the matches. And behind it came two major factors: Frank Gotch's ego and the promoter's greed. In 1936, one of the earliest screw jobs in wrestling history involved the inventor of one of the most used wrestling maneuvers, the Irish Whip. Hailing from County Cork, Ireland, the tough Irishman Dano O'Mahony. O'Mahony had reportedly said that he had never been asked to lie down, despite being a questionable grappler, but still a tough man in an era where the grapplers ruled the wrestling game. Still, he managed to become a big draw. Boston promoter Paul Bowser pushed him big, knowing how big of a draw he would be to the Irish immigrant crowd in Boston, Massachusetts. Similar to how Bruno Sammartino became champion of the greater New York region in professional wrestling for the Italian-American crowd there in New York City in the 1960s and 70s. O'Mahony won 49 straight matches, being built to an opportunity for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship against then-champion Jim Londos. In June of 1935, at Boston's Fenway Park, a massive crowd assembled deeply behind Mahoney as he would challenge for the National Wrestling Association's World Heavyweight Championship. Dano became the first Irish-born World Heavyweight Champion in professional wrestling. The Shamrock Goldberg of the 1930s would continue to be quite the draw, even headlining Yankee Stadium in New York City. But it would take a dark turn. One wrestler who wasn't going to do the job for Dano was Dick Shakat. In a move that wasn't uncommon as you might think, Shakat was a legitimate tough man and went to work on O'Mahony during their bout. The two had faced off before, but O'Mahony had won the first contest via disqualification when Shakat had kicked him so hard that the Irishman suffered legitimate broken ribs. On March 2nd, 1936, it got even more off the rails between Dano and Shakat. Shakat went into business for himself just 5 minutes into the main event bout, and back then, if a champion was disqualified or counted out, he would lose their championship title. Reluctantly, the Irishman had to go back into the ring and get the crap beaten out of him. In Madison Square Garden, Dano got caught by a legitimate hold from Shakat, and that was it. He had to lose the title and tap out, leading to Shakat becoming the new World Heavyweight Champion. Dano may not have been the legitimate shooter, but he was the draw, and his star power as a stadium attraction simply just wasn't the same after this. Now, how did this happen? Why did this happen? According to combat sports historian Ken Zimmerman Jr., the source of the story really goes back to Dick Shakat having been cheated out of the title 4 years earlier by promoter Paul Bowser when he was supposed to beat Ed Strangler Lewis, only for Lewis to drop the title to someone else. This was a little bit beyond greed. This was outright revenge for Shakat. Screwjobs have always been a direct reflection of politics within professional wrestling. And someone we mentioned earlier, Ed Strangler Lewis. He was reportedly the king of this maneuver, being involved in not just one, not two, but 3 of them. The first one had very little involvement from him because it ended up seeing him losing the world championship to a green and popular football player by the name of Wayne Munn. This set up a situation where a wrestler by the name of Stanislaus Zbyszko screwed Munn out of his championship by suddenly turning it into a shoot before the cowardly Zbyszko jumped ship to the promotion of a wrestler by the name of Joe Strecker. Strangler Lewis's second screw job was a little bit more sinister. Promoter Paul Bowser wanted Ed Lewis to drop his title to a wrestler by the name of Ed Don George, a man who had represented the United States in Amsterdam at the Olympics in 1928. Lewis just went like, "That doesn't work for me, brother," and threatened to beat the ever-living daylights out of Don George. By simply imposing violent threats, he regained the title in their scheduled match. But the story doesn't end there. Later that year, promoter Paul Bowser once again had an opportunity for payback himself. Strangler Lewis would face Henri Daglan in a 2 out of 3 falls match. Lewis already had major issues with promoter Paul Bowser and had already used his legitimate skills to shoot a championship off one of his chosen boys. Now it was time for Bowser to get his revenge through Henri Deglan. Between the second and third fall, Deglan went backstage and bit his arm, causing it to bleed. He disguised this well enough because when the third fall started, Henri screamed in agony and revealed his wound, forcing the referee, under the rules at the time, to disqualify Lewis. This was about where Lewis was told he would win, and it went down in Montreal. Yeah, it was the original Montreal Screwjob. Yes, as a result of manipulative master stroking by Bowser, it would get the world title off of Ed Strangler Lewis. There was even a 1950 Screwjob involving one of the most important wrestlers of all time, a man we did a big video about recently. Go check it out on the channel, Gorgeous George. If you didn't watch that video, we highly suggest you do it. But in short, Gorgeous George was the most influential pre-1980s pro wrestler by a massive margin. He may have been the first real national television star. Professional wrestling wouldn't have the showmanship, the flair, the psychology, and the character work it eventually did without Gorgeous George's work. Funny enough, just like the Montreal Screwjob 47 years later, there was a referee named Earl involved in this scenario. Don Eagle was set to defend his world title against Gorgeous George and presumed that he would walk out of the match with his title, and was even told as much before the bell rang. This time, the promoters were like, "That doesn't work for me, brother," and crafted a finish where the referee, Earl Mallahan, would betray Don Eagle by counting a pinfall despite him kicking out at 2. Suddenly, Gorgeous George was the champion, and Don Eagle left the building presumably heartbroken. But he was suspended by the Illinois Athletic Commission for attacking the referee post-match. In what would be known as the Chicago short count, the Chicago crowd in attendance would not respond too kindly in the International Amphitheater that night in 1950. TV commentator Russ Davis would recall, "Boy, this is a shamble, and fans are throwing things into the honest to goodness, things have really happened around here. I've never seen a crowd in as ugly a mood as this gang here tonight." There aren't too many accounts stating whether or not Gorgeous George was in on the entire ruse, but there seems to be some speculation that even he wasn't aware of how it was going to play out. In reality, the two men were just pawns in a much larger game. The promoter, Fred Kohler from Chicago, wanted revenge against the previously mentioned Paul Bowser. Yeah, he comes up again, and another promoter by the name of Paul Hoft for their alliance with his sworn rival, another promoter by the name of Leonard Schwartz. Kohler complained that Al Haft begged him to push Chief Don Eagle and elevate his stardom, only to tie Eagle into a contract that made it hard to wrestle for other promotions. In an act of vengeance, Kohler had Eagle be the victim of this screw job so he could devalue his stardom and send him back to half of the superstar he was before. Man, politics are insane here. Oh, and Kohler went on to become the president of the NWA for a whole year as well. Jumping up to the 1980s rock and wrestling boom period, launched by WWE, then known by WWF, they had their own screw job that was absolutely ridiculous. It was one of the ugliest scenes in the history of women's pro wrestling, and while the women then were trying to fight for credibility and ring time in a crowded space during a big time in the business, this would be a real setback. On one side of the ring, you have the fabulous Moolah, who was once celebrated as a women's wrestling legend, only to be exposed years later for some pretty evil behavior within the industry and her alleged abuse of other wrestlers and politicking to stay above them. This was supposed to be a passing of the torch match between her and the up-and-coming Wendy RoR. It was a rightful changing of the guard type moment. July 23rd, 1984, in the world's most famous arena, Madison Square Garden. A day after her 61st birthday, Moolah would take on RoR, who obviously had the celebrity bump, with very popular pop singer Cyndi Lauper at her side. Yes, defeating Moolah, ending what was the longest reign in professional wrestling history as a champion at that point, 28 years. years. Yes, 28 years Moolah had the championship. Some would argue it was 7 years, but like 21 years of inconsistent title defenses. But that's not the point. The point is how Moolah had a chokehold on women's wrestling and had been accused of being one of the biggest politicers in the business, and maybe it took that long to progress the wrestling business beyond her. Leilani Kai would dethrone Wendy Richter, but Richter would win the title back at the first WrestleMania. Things were booming, things were great. Wendy Richter was the most popular and successful women's wrestler in the world. But behind the scenes, things weren't as great, as Richter and then WWE boss Vince McMahon reportedly were butting heads on a contract dispute, and WWE was continuing to roar successfully on. McMahon's side of the story was that Richter refused to sign a contract, while Wendy swore she was in the middle of a 5-year deal and had regular disagreements about compensation. McMahon then reportedly concocted some type of plan to get the title off the then women's champion. In November of '85, Richter was scheduled to defend her title once again against a mysterious challenger, a masked wrestler known as the Spider Lady. Backstage that night at MSG, Richter was surprised to see Fabulous Moolah there, because Moolah had made it a habit not to be on shows she wasn't scheduled to wrestle on. When the time came for the women's championship match, Richter was shocked when the referee counted 3 despite her kicking out at 1. Of course, she realized she had been set up, and the Spider Lady was revealed to be Fabulous Moolah. The paranoia of McMahon was a driving force here, reportedly, but Moolah was the perfect pawn for him to use, perhaps because of the financial control that she had over all other female wrestlers. The fear of what could happen with an unruly women's champion within the WWE ranks would oddly enough play into why the biggest screwjob of all times would occur years later. When talking about the Montreal Screwjob of 1997, it's important to consider all of the elements at play in the big Monday Night Wars between WWE and their arch nemesis, WCW. Reportedly, McMahon's paranoia revolved around Alundra Blaze. She was a valiant fighting champion for WWE, but like too many women in the business at the time, she felt underappreciated and left for WCW. But she brought something with her. Taking on the name Medusa once again, she appeared on WCW television with the WWE Women's Championship and dropped it in the trash. To avoid this happening again, McMahon felt, reportedly, that he couldn't take Bret Hart at his word, that he would leave the company in an honorable way and would simply hand the championship over before taking on a big money contract with WCW. And then, of course, the infamous Screwjob in Montreal happened, and that became the biggest controversy ever booked in a wrestling ring for quite some time. But the reality is that Bret Hart didn't exactly have a fruitful career in WCW for a few years there. The Montreal Screwjob helped create the Mr. McMahon character, the biggest bankable villain in wrestling history, opposed against the biggest bankable hero in Stone Cold Steve Austin. And this directly ushered in the Attitude Era. That's right, one of the worst moments in wrestling created one of the biggest boom periods in wrestling. And the idea of a screw job as a wrestling angle where everyone's in on the story has been utilized many times since. Just like a year later at Survivor Series 1998, the screw job was recreated, this time as a full-fledged story, with The Rock becoming the corporate WWE champion and screwing out the beloved Mankind for the title. This has become a trope in wrestling that continues to be used in different ways. Even the recent Clash at the Castle incident with CM Punk and Drew McIntyre was sort of a twist on that entire angle. When it becomes the psychology of screw jobs in wrestling, we can think of a few words that string them together: greed, ego, jealousy, and paranoia. These are what makes screw jobs one of the worst things that have come out of the professional wrestling industry. Many critics of professional wrestling have called it a selfish industry, and this is manifested in the most clear way in screw jobs, especially the legitimate ones. It certainly isn't the worst issue from the entire business, but it's a sign of just how cutthroat pro wrestling has historically been. It may not be the same way anymore, and a lot has certainly changed. But the reality is, a lot of competition is always amongst the peers in wrestling. And when egos get in the way and politics come out of it at the end, sometimes this is the unfortunate result. We can only hope for the days of legitimate screwjobs like the Montreal one being simply a thing of the past, something that will never happen again. Hope it's truly something of the past we never see again. Thanks for watching. Let us know what you think in the comments below.